Welcome back to the Arise Exchange right here on Arise News. We keep the ball rolling on the show as we take a look at the top stories from the Eastern African front. The NSC, that's the Nairobi Exchange, admitting its first Islamic product on its unquoted securities platform. Also, Kenya repaying $300 million in early Eurobond installment. That's called a callable bond. Yeah, callable bond. You can recall the bond. You have the obligation, the choice to recall the bond early. Safaricom's profit rises 2.1% year on year, 34.2 billion shillings. And Tanzania's Lesseho Fadika Bank third quarter profit, 1.3 billion shillings. That's what's going on the East African front as we take a look at the news coming out from Eastern Africa. Now, from Eastern Africa, we're going to Northern Africa. The Africa Investment Forum Marketplace for 2023. It wrapped up today in Morocco. One of today's key discussions was headlined by a panel. This was a really good panel dedicated to Africa's quest to ramp up on renewable and other natural sources of energy. Take a listen to this.
To develop a bankable project, there's many aspects to be taken care of. Like, for example, technical aspects. So you need to have a project that is able to produce properly. So this is also why at Hydroneo we have structured the company. So the team, the technical team is internal to the company. And there's also a lot of environmental and social aspects that needs to be taken care of.
We believe that natural gas is the key transition fuel for the world, not just for Africa. Nothing has highlighted it more than the Ukraine war, and it's evident that in order to have a relatively smooth transition to renewables, we need natural gas. Within Africa, of course, there's a lot of resource. So when we talk about natural capital, I see our natural gas resources as being part of that as well. And you started by asking about supply and demand and the gap in between, and I'll just play to that to where natural gas fits in as well. So my company, Nigeria LNG, supported the Nigerian government in its decade of gas aspiration. And what we realized was that to achieve that, you needed to understand the supply side, you needed to understand the demand side, but then you also needed to address not only infrastructure, which is where a lot of the conversation about bankability and so on comes in, but it's the commercial element as well. So structurally, there are many countries, Nigeria included, where subsidies have completely distorted the system and made it unworkable. And if you don't address the commercial aspects of that, whether it is by removing subsidies, but then also looking after the vulnerable populations or other models, then you're actually never going to manage to connect the supply and the demand. We believe that natural gas is going to help with, number one, the displacement of more polluting hydrocarbons, whether it is coal, oil, or biomass. But we also believe that the natural gas system itself can and is being decarbonized as well to contribute its own share. We would all love for the world to leapfrog from where we are today straight into 100% renewable tomorrow. We would love that, if it was possible. We know it's not. And once again, the fractured supply situation that emanated out of the Ukraine war just demonstrated that very precisely to the world. And so we know there has to be a journey and a transition. In that, you have the choice to either continue with what we've traditionally used until they are replaced by renewables, or to actually use natural gas to accelerate the displacement of things like coal.
The biggest driver of the reduction, the US has reduced the carbon intensity of its economy and the amount of carbon emitted from its energy grid by a massive factor over the last few years, purely because of the transition that Philip talked about from coal towards natural gas. For countries with large fossil fuel legacy endowments, one of the only ways they can be in line with the Paris agreements is to move more and more to natural gas. And for Africa, if we have the natural gas, we should take advantage of that market opportunity. For some African countries, just to be clear, for some African countries, it may also make sense to use some of that natural gas for your own onshore use, but we need to also keep in mind that we have another resource that is actually unparalleled. The equation for African renewables is different from many other places for exactly the reason he alluded to, which is if I'm in Europe, I have to deal with, when I deploy my solar plant, I have to deal with the fact that for 3 months of the year, I'm getting substantially less yield than I would otherwise because of seasonality. In much of Africa, you don't have that problem. And so the amount of, the degree to which we can build up bankable, we can bank on a renewable base for our fleet is actually higher than the rest of the world. Now, what that allows us to do is stop thinking about financing our energy system purely for our current consumption or for our local consumption, and instead start saying, how is Africa more competitive? Part of the reason we are only 6% of global energy usage is we have a tiny proportion of global productive industry. But in a world of renewables, which are hard to move, it makes sense to be saying, how are we moving high energy industry from where it is today to places where you do have a high degree of green energy that's not being used? And at the same time, let's use our natural gas resources both to balance our grid, have dispatchable power when we need it, peaking and so on. But a lot of it is for export to generate the balance sheet that allows us to build out energy systems that will be around for 200 years.
And I will say this, to put things into correct context. If you replace coal with natural gas, you are able to reduce emissions by 40%, period. If you replace HF4 or diesel by gas, you are able to reduce emissions by another 20%. So I think what we need to appreciate is that transition is not what we used to call in maths a step function. Transition takes place over a long period of time. And what we need in Africa, as James alluded, is to be able to optimize our generation mix, our energy mix. It has to, because there are instances that much as you'd like to have output and much as you may have capacity to generate, it is just not possible because, for example, there's no sunshine. Or if it's wind, there's no wind. I'll give you a real example. 3 weeks ago, we were here, and my team went to Wazizate, which is the largest concentrated solar power plant in the world that was developed by the bank, among other lenders. On this particular day, out of 510 megawatts of installed capacity, it was producing 0 because there was no sunshine. So I think the ability for gas to provide what I call flexible generation is a huge pull factor for the continued utilization of gas as a transition fuel. And that's why the bank is bold enough to say that, yes, we understand that we need to transition, but even when you talk about the word transition, it's actually a misnomer for Africa, because most of Africans' contribution to emissions to date has only been 3%. So what are you transiting from?
Regions in the world, it has taken long, it has taken basically government money over decades or centuries. We don't have the privilege of waiting that long. So we have to tap into non-government sources of capital. There is no other way, I believe. Technology is helping. These mini-grids, distributed power is the solution. But let me focus on the access to capital element here, because it's honestly where I can contribute more to this discussion. And access to capital is allowing capital to get the returns. And there are enormous and great case studies in Africa, and we just need to have a replication of those for two reasons. One, because those projects, and I will give you one very specific example, to make it more visible. Those projects will bring the macroeconomic stability that will allow for the returns to be provided to the investors. That's very, very important. And second, it will create the confidence for investors to come, and it shows how it is possible.